Hello there. My name is Stephen O'Hara and I'm a traditional storyteller. And I'm going to tell you a wee story about Ballymoney. Once upon a time, in the wee town of Ballymoney, there was a shoemaker. And he lived there with his wife and he lived above the shop and he had his business in Meeting House Street, just off Church Street. And he counted himself to be pretty fortunate because anybody who came to Ballymoney for shopping, they were almost bound to walk past his door. And he was a good man, and he was an honest man, and he was a hard-working man. But that year, he just didn't seem to be able to make any money. And in fact, he'd lost everything he owned, and he was down to just enough leather to make one more pair of shoes. You see, a terrible sickness had spread across the land, and many people couldn't go to work and couldn't earn money. And those that had money had so little that they had trouble keeping their families, so they hadn't money to be spending on new shoes. But he cut the leather out and laid it on his work table, and he thought, if I go to bed early, I'll be able to get up early, make the shoes, and maybe tomorrow I'll sell them, and then we'll have a wee bit of money to buy things for the house. And he did that. He cut the leather out and he went up his stairs and he said his prayers and he was about to get into bed when he saw out the window that there was a kind of a rain falling that wasn't really rain. It was a sleety kind of rain. It was almost snow. But it was that early December kind of snow. The stuff that doesn't lie on the ground, not the stuff you get at Christmas. And he smiled because it reminded him that the winter was here and that his favourite time of year was just round the corner, and that was Christmas. So he slept all night, and in the morning he got up nice and early and he went down to his workshop, and an absolute surprise to him, instead of the leather lying there, there was a perfectly made, perfectly stitched pair of brand new shoes. Well, his eyes nearly popped out of his head. He looked at the shoes and he picked them up to inspect them and he held them up to the light. And from the perfect heel right up to the polished toe, even the wee laces in them were tied in a neat bow. They were made as perfectly as if he'd done them himself. And he had no idea how it happened, but he thanked his stars that he'd found a wee bit of luck at last. And as he was standing admiring the shoes, the shop door, the bell tinkled, and in came a customer. He saw the shoes, and they were of such a high quality, he had to have them. And in fact, he paid the shoemaker more for the shoes than he was asking for them. And he said, "Can you deliver them to me? I'm staying up in the Manor Hotel." And the shoemaker said, "I'll package them up nicely, sir, and deliver them straight to you." And the customer left. Well, the shoemaker jigged about the shop and got a nice package and wrapped it up and put a ribbon and a bow on it and set off to deliver it. He had enough money made from the sale of those shoes that he could buy leather in the bootmaker's shop on Main Street. He could buy enough to make 2 pairs of shoes tonight. And he had some money left over to buy food and items for the house. So he walked up the street, he delivered the shoes, and he called into some of the smaller shops in the town. And every shop he went into, he just smiled and felt a warm glow inside because the Christmas decorations were going up. There was Christmas music playing all through the town. In Castlecroft Court, there was the most beautiful Christmas tree that he thinks Ballymoney ever saw. And every shop he went into, he wanted to tell the shopkeeper, "Here, wait till you hear what happened to me last night." But he thought, "I better not tempt my luck." So he kept quiet. And he just merrily went round the town, came home with his leather to make 2 pairs of shoes, and the day had worn in. Before bed that night, he did the same thing. He cut them out into the patterns to make 2 pairs of shoes from the leather, and he smoothed it out flat on his work table, and he went to bed. Do you know, when he got up in the morning, the exact same thing had happened, but instead of 1 pair of shoes, there were 2 pairs of perfect shoes. He sold them really quickly, and do you know what? People started hearing about the perfect shoes made in Ballymoney, and they came from all the towns and villages around. He sold boots in Ballybogey. He sold kickers in Kilrats, loafers in Lochgiel. He sold pumps in Portstewart. and he sold slippers in Sternockham. He even sold flip-flops in Finvoy, and his name and his fame spread all across the country. And you know, as the month of December wore on, he and his wife became quite well off. There was plenty of money. They were very happy. And there was one evening, the evening before Christmas Eve, that they were chatting in front of the fire, and she said, "You know, I think we should go down to the workshop tonight and see who this person is who's doing our work for us." And the shoemaker said that was a great idea. So they did. They went down to the workshop after dark, and in the corner of the room there was a long curtain that went right to the floor. And they hid in behind the curtain, and they just peeked out occasionally. And they had to wait quite a long time. And as they did, he could see from the front window of the shop that snow was falling. Not that early December stuff. This is the good, thick, white, Christmassy stuff. And the two of them just looked at each other and giggled, because they knew that the children of Ballymoney were going to be waking up in 2 mornings, and the whole country would be blanketed in white. And then they went quiet again, and they started to hear all the noises that a house makes at night. They heard floors creaking upstairs. They heard taps dripping and pipes rattling. And then the door creaked open, and in capered these 2 tiny little naked fairies. And they capered across the floor, and they skipped and they hopped, and they were giggling and laughing, and they jumped up onto the shoemaker's bench, and with their tiny little fingers they stitched and they shaped and they nailed and they wrapped, and inside no time at all they had a whole pile of shoes made and ready for sale. And then they jumped down and giggled and laughed their way out of the room and capered away out of the door. Well, the shoemaker and his wife were shocked, surprised, amazed, delighted, and they went and they looked at the work that the 2 fairies had left behind. And she said, "Did you notice that they had no clothes on?" And he said, "I saw that." And she says, "You know, they've done so much for us. They've brought so much good fortune to our family. Do you think we could do something for them?" And he said, "What do you think we could do?" And she said, "Well, if we spend tomorrow making clothes for them, I could make them 2 tiny little waistcoats, and 2 tiny little shirts, and 2 tiny little pairs of trousers. You could make 2 tiny little pairs of fairy shoes for their feet. Do you think is that a good idea?" And he chuckled and he said that was a fantastic idea. And that's what they did. They spent the rest of the day making tiny little fairy clothes and tiny little fairy shoes. And as darkness fell, they laid everything out on the table where every other night they had laid just plain flat leather. Tonight they laid the gift of the fairy clothes and shoes. And they went and they hid behind the curtain. And again the house creaked its way through the night, and the taps dripped their way through the night, and the house made all the noises that houses make after dark. And then about midnight the door creaked open, and in capered these 2 naked little fairies, skipping and hopping and jigging and laughing across the floor, and they as usual jumped up on the shoemaker's bench, and instead of leather, what was in front of them? 2 perfect suits of clothing and 2 perfect pairs of shoes. Well, they jumped into those clothes and shoes like lightning, and they stood admiring each other and commenting on how lovely they each looked, and one of them stood on his head and the other one turned a cartwheel, and they both capered and skipped off out of the room, and they skipped to the front door and they skipped off across the green, and the shoemaker and his wife never saw them again. But I do know that everything went well for the shoemaker and his wife from that day forward and for the rest of their lives. So I suppose the point of my story is, if somebody does you a good turn, you should find a way to do them a good turn back. And Christmas is a good time for doing nice things for people who have done you a favour. But remember, children, at Christmas, don't forget to look for the fairies.